Spencer Stuart is here, and he is our books expert on North by Northwest. And if you're an avid gardener, you probably have at least a couple of books on your shelves offering advice on how to garden, how to make the most of your land or your pots. Did you ever wonder what early gardening books look like? Perhaps the first gardening book guidebook ever? Well, there is an actual answer to that question, at least in the English-speaking world, and Spencer Stuart told me all about it.
The book that we'll be talking about, it's written by Thomas Hill, and it was published in 1558. And the long title is a most brief and pleasant treatise teaching how to dress, sow, and set a garden. And there were two editions that came out before his death in 1574, and they went under another title. They changed it to The Profitable Art of Gardening by that point.
Something snappier.
Yeah, a little bit more, it really gets people's attention. And then, by 1600, there had been 5 editions printed of this book. So it was a popular read for the time.
So that's quite a thing. What was the writing about gardening like before this book came out?
Because it's really the first in the sort of English publishing history, it misses the mark in some ways, but it's an interesting beginning of a genre that really explodes even by the early 1600s. It's interesting to point out that Hill, he wasn't a gardener. He doesn't actually at any point admit to being a gardener. His background is in publishing, and he's a translator. He translates all sorts of books, and his name can be seen in a number of publications at the time. And what he does in this book, actually, is he's not so much writing it as he is providing translations of writers from the past, and specifically from antiquity. So he's quoting Pliny, he's quoting Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle on recommendations for particular times of the season to plant seeds, how to prepare your garden for the harvest period, all these sorts of things. And so what's interesting is that it's the first kind of how-to publication. However, the climate is completely inappropriate. It's all to do with the sort of Mediterranean, and so you do find in reading it that it doesn't fully apply to the context he's publishing for, but certainly it shows a viable option for a number of publishers by the 1600s, and people start to write about their experience. And that's what I think is really interesting about this book, is what it starts.
So the fact that he was not a gardener and didn't realize that the Mediterranean climate was really not that useful to know about if you're gardening, say, in Hertfordshire. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting to point out that, there was a posthumous publication done under his name called The Gardeners Labyrinth, and that was in 1577. And that one has actually some topical discussions. It mentions herbs and roots of the kitchen, and mentioning how to grow onions, spinach, beets, things of that nature, cabbage, leeks. So that by that point it's hitting the right tone, but early on it seems somewhat odd when you're reading it.
What was happening at that point in the 1500s that made him think, I wonder, I think we need a book with a gardening manual?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting to see. There's a social historian and economist by the name of Chris Dyer who researched medieval food production around that time. And from looking at various records and the way that land was laid out, peasant holdings typically consisted of a cottage and a plot of land. And in around 1300, he suggested that there were roughly 1 million of these on the British Isles. And certainly the printing history of this book, but also the format of the book, that it was printed in octavo format and written in the vernacular English, suggests that there was enough evidence, and certainly there are references that Hill makes in the introduction, of it being something that was commonly practiced by people of that time. So, you sort of see that he's responding to what he sees around him.
What does it look like, Spencer? Are there lots of drawings in it?
Yeah, there are wood blocks in it, and this is another interesting element to it, and certainly other books around that time that touch on that genre have a couple of wood blocks as well. They give you an interesting perspective for us in the present, looking back, because oftentimes when we're thinking about garden history, garden design history, historians use paintings quite often. And this is not a kind of an accurate portrayal of what's happening in the everyday experience of Elizabethan gardening practice. So, reading the descriptions of how to set up the land gives you a little bit more of a look into what would have been like to be in a town at that point and see how these plots were laid out. In 2010, Kenilworth Castle kind of did a revamping of what they thought was an Elizabethan garden. And, this one was actually, it was a very specific example of a garden from the Elizabethan period. And it was actually created specifically and with no expense spared for the Queen of England's visit to his castle. And so, even our access to the everyday of that time is often selected for the exceptional cases and not the everyday. Right. So these books provide a really interesting glimpse into that practice, into what everyone was experiencing.
Right, because that guy, Kenilworth Castle, he probably wasn't doing a lot of planting of cabbages in advance of the Queen's visit, right?
No, that's right. And even you notice in the prefaces of some of the other writers of the time that they often talk about it as being something for both the rich and the poor. And the writing suggests that, as well as the formats, that they were quite, they were easily accessible books for people. It would have been a bit of an expense, but it would have been seen as worth it for, setting up your garden so that you can make it quite productive. It starts an interesting shift. If you start to look at some of the other books that are inspired by Hill, so Hill publishes this book, it's a success, publishers start to see this as an opportunity, they start to solicit writers, and writers also start to put together books as well. And what you see is a shift from these references to antiquity, like Hill was doing, of Virgil, Aristotle, people like that, and what you see is a shift into knowledge through experience, and really the rise of the gardener. As we know today, you think of someone like a Monty Don, or a character like this, who's like an expert gardener who provides you with sound advice as to, how to prepare for the coming season, or some possible alterations that you could make to your plot of land. This really starts around this time. One example that's always interesting is William Lawson's book, A New Orchard and Garden, published in 1618. In which, in the preface, he says that, a lot of the writing in the book derives from his 48 years of experience and observation. And, that's an interesting conceptual shift that's happening in the culture as well, of what people are finding as important information. It's a shift from antiquity through to an idea of experience and observation of the land. Interestingly enough, that this whole discussion of the English garden as we know it today, one that has kind of ornamental flowers and things of that nature, there's almost no mention of ornamental flowers in these early books. One of the earliest instances is through Parkinson's book of 1629, and he was in a really specific position to be able to talk about this. As being that he was the apothecary as well as the botanical advisor for Charles I. And actually in that book, it contains a mention of 1,000 plants that he grew himself. And so by that point, he talks about flowers for beauty's sake. But up until that point, there's really not much mention of them. In Hill's earlier book of The Gardeners Labyrinth of 1577, there's mention of marigolds, lavender, gillyflower, cornations, things of that nature, and they're actually discussed for the utility of you you clip them and bring them into the house to refresh the house.
Huh.
So it's all about the use.
It's so interesting when you think now about all of the books, the thousands and thousands and thousands of books about all kinds of gardening and specific things about gardening and new ones all the time. A lot of the information hasn't changed too much, but it's interesting to think it all traces back to this moment, this kind of sea change, I guess, in the late 1500s.
Yeah, and it's something that you find this in these early books as well, something that you hear even today, that there's a little bit of guidance that allows for people to have the confidence to get out there and get their hands dirty. And there's this, there's mention in even Hill's work, even though he wasn't really a gardener, but certainly in Parkinson's and Lawson's work, of the benefits to the mind to be in the garden. There's always this mention in it of, this is how you ought to prepare this, but you should get out there, because it's valuable not only for the food that you can provide, but also for that feeling of actually raising something. So I think there are some themes in there that we keep coming back to, because it is very gratifying and very, very satisfying. So the spring is coming, and it's quite exciting to get back into the garden again.
Spencer Stuart, he's our books expert here on North by Northwest, and he drops by every once in a while to talk about something in the history of publishing. He was talking about Thomas Hill's 1558 gardening manual, probably the first, in the English language, a most brief and pleasant treatise teaching how to dress, sow, and set a garden.